Adrian had a way of making power look like peace. In public, he was the kind of man people praised with lowered voices, wealthy, composed, always in control, always respectable. In private, that same calmness was what made him dangerous. He didn't need to shout to win an argument. He only needed to remind Maribel, gently and often, that everything around them, this mansion, the staff, the cars, even the air she breathed without fear of rent, came through him. Maribel learned early that speaking too much attracted consequences. Adrian disliked questions. He disliked tone. He disliked a woman who sounded like she had options. So she became soft-spoken, careful, and almost invisible in her own marriage, measuring her words the way one measures salt, small pinches, never enough to offend. Yet even her silence did not protect her from what he was. Adrian was a professional cheater, not the sloppy kind that gets caught by accident, but the strategic kind who treated infidelity like a hobby he was proud of. He returned home when he pleased, offered affection when it suited him, withdrew warmth when he wanted compliance. And whenever Maribel's eyes looked too wounded, he'd tilt his head and say the same thing in different wrappers. Be grateful. Others would beg for this life. That afternoon, Adrian came home earlier than usual, not to surprise her with love, but to deliver a verdict. The living room was too bright, too neat, the kind of place meant for celebrations, not funerals of trust. Maribel was arranging flowers' small nervous movements, when he called her name in a voice that sounded polite enough to fool a visitor. She turned and saw him standing there with that familiar stillness, suit jacket still on, cufflinks shining, eyes unreadable. He didn't ask if she'd eaten. He didn't ask how her day was. He sat down like a man about to sign a contract and patted the seat opposite him the way a boss summons an employee. Maribel's stomach tightened before he spoke, because her body had learned to recognize the moments when her life was about to be rearranged without her permission. Adrian inhaled slowly and said, "I'm leaving." The words landed softly, but they cracked something in the room. Maribel blinked, then forced a laugh that came out thin. "Leaving? As in travel?" she asked, already knowing it wasn't. Adrian's mouth moved like he was bored by her confusion. "Leaving as in I'm done," he said. "I've met someone else. She understands me. She isn't monotonous." Maribel felt heat rush to her face, then cold. She tried to speak, but her voice broke into pieces before it formed a sentence. "Adrian, please," she started, not even sure what she was begging for yet, an explanation, a second chance, a sign that he had a heart. He watched her cry the way someone watches rain through a window, acknowledging it, unmoved by it. "Don't do that," he said, calm as ever, and somehow that calmness made it worse. Maribel's tears increased, not loud sobs, but a quiet shaking that made her look smaller than she already felt. She reached for words that could reach him. The years, the vows, the nights she waited up for him when he didn't come home, the way she kept forgiving because she thought patience was love. But Adrian didn't allow speeches. He lifted a hand slightly, and the gesture alone forced silence. "I didn't come here to debate," he said. "I'm telling you what's happening." Maribel's throat burned. "Is it because I can't?" She stopped herself, because she knew better than to mention children, better than to mention the painful topic he used as a weapon whenever he wanted to remind her she was lacking. Adrian leaned back and studied her like she was a decision he'd already made peace with. "You become boring," he said plainly, as if that was the most reasonable explanation in the world. "And I'm not the kind of man who stays where he's no longer entertained." The cruelty wasn't only in the sentence, it was in the ease with which he said it, like he was discussing a change of furniture. Maribel covered her mouth with her palm to hold in a sound that might embarrass her. Adrian stood, straightened his sleeves, and concluded, "I'm leaving, Maribel. Accept it." And in that moment, she understood something terrifying. This wasn't a fight she could win, because Adrian wasn't fighting. He was simply taking. Adrian did not give Maribel time to recover from the first blow before he delivered the second one wrapped in fake mercy. The next morning, he was already moving like a man on schedule, like someone preparing for a trip that had nothing to do with heartbreak and everything to do with freedom. He spoke about flights, paperwork, relocation, words that sounded too organized for a decision that was supposedly sudden. Maribel followed him through the house like a shadow, eyes swollen, hair slightly undone, trying to catch his attention the way a child tries to catch a departing parent. She waited until he stood near the dining table with his phone in hand, and finally asked, "So what happens to me?" The question came out small, almost ashamed, because it felt humiliating to ask where you belong in a home you once helped make warm. Adrian didn't even look up fully. "You'll be fine," he said, scrolling. Maribel's voice rose a little, not into anger, but into desperation. "Fine how? Adrian, you can't just—" He stopped scrolling and finally looked at her, and that look alone was a warning. "I can," he said simply. "And I am." Then he added, as if he was doing charity, "I'll gift you one of my smaller houses. You'll start over there." The word gift sounded like a joke. It wasn't romance. It wasn't kindness. It was relocation, exile disguised as generosity. Maribel's knees almost failed her. She sat down not because she wanted to, but because her body couldn't carry the shock standing up. "A house?" she repeated, as if the size of the object could soften the cruelty of the action. "You're leaving me and calling help." Adrian's expression tightened with irritation, like she was being ungrateful. "You want me to do what exactly?" he asked. "Keep you in the mansion while I live abroad? So you can cry in my rooms and disturb my peace?" "No." Maribel's tears returned, hot and unstoppable. "Adrian, please," she begged, voice cracking. "We can fix this. Whatever I did, we can fix it. Just give us time. Give me a chance." She reached across the table, as if physical closeness could awaken something human in him. But Adrian leaned back, refusing even the touch. "Maribel," he said, and his tone became sharper, colder. "I'm not leaving because you did something. I'm leaving because I don't want this anymore. I'm tired. I want something new." She tried another angle, softer, trembling. "Is it her? Is she forcing you?" Adrian's mouth curled in a humorless half-smile. "No one forces me," he said. "I decide. That's what you've never understood." And there it was again, his favorite weapon, the reminder that he had control, that her feelings were not equal to his choices. By evening, the house had changed. Suitcases stood near the hallway like soldiers. Adrian's cologne lingered in the air, sharp and expensive, blending with Maribel's quiet sobs, like two separate worlds refusing to mix. Staff members walked carefully, pretending not to notice, their eyes lowered, because wealth in that house was not just money, it was fear. Maribel followed Adrian into the bedroom and watched him fold shirts with the same calm he used to fold his lies. "So this is it," she whispered, almost to herself. Adrian zipped the suitcase and finally faced her fully. "Yes," he said. Maribel shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. "How can you be so brutal?" she asked. "How can you just leave like I meant nothing?" Adrian stepped closer, not to comfort her, but to end the conversation. "Listen carefully," he said, voice low. "I'm giving you a house. That's more than most women get when men leave them. Don't turn this into drama." Maribel flinched at the word drama, like it was an insult for having a heart. He picked up his travel bag, then paused at the door as if remembering one final instruction. "And don't try to contact me," he added, cold as stone. "Once I leave, you won't hear from me again. I'm cutting every line. I don't want reminders. I don't want noise." Maribel's lips parted, but nothing came out. Adrian walked out with the finality of a judge leaving court. And as the door shut behind him, Maribel stood in the middle of the room, trembling, realizing the gift wasn't a gift at all. It was a cage placed somewhere else, far from a life she knew, so Adrian could disappear without guilt following him. Adrian left Nigeria like a man escaping a delayed consequence. He boarded his flight without looking back, surrounded by comfort, confidence, and the thrilling belief that he had outsmarted responsibility. Overseas, everything looked fresh. New streets, new restaurants, new laughter in unfamiliar accents. He convinced himself that distance would erase the parts of his life that required patience, marriage, loyalty, apology. He moved into a luxurious apartment, posted pictures that suggested peace, and acted as though the previous years were a coat he had finally removed. Meanwhile, back in Nigeria, Maribel's world shrank into a quiet corner of reality. She didn't get a goodbye call. No, I arrived safely. No message. Nothing. The silence was not accidental, it was designed. The numbers, she knew, stopped connecting. Emails, if she tried, felt like shouting into a closed room. Even mutual contacts suddenly behaved like they had forgotten her name. It was as if Adrian had not only left, he had erased her. The smaller house Adrian gifted her was not a ruin, but it wasn't home either. It sat in a calmer neighborhood, quieter streets, less noise, yet the quiet felt cruel, because it carried no laughter, no warmth, no familiar rhythm. On the day Maribel moved in, the sky was bright, but she felt like she was walking into an unlit future. She stood in the empty living room with one suitcase and listened to her own breathing like it was the only proof she still existed. The walls were clean. The floors were shiny. But the place felt like an apology that never arrived. She wandered from room to room, touching door handles, checking cupboards, staring at the bare curtains. Every corner reminded her of what Adrian had taken, not only the marriage, but the certainty of tomorrow. She tried to sleep that first night, but her mind played loops of his voice. You've become boring. I'm done. Don't contact me. The words landed again and again like stones. She woke up at odd hours, expecting the sound of his footsteps, then remembering he had built his happiness on her absence. In the morning, she made tea she didn't drink, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at her phone as if the screen might suddenly reveal a miracle. Days passed, and the reality of being cut off became sharper. Maribel began to understand that Adrian hadn't just ended a relationship. He had ended her access to his world. Staff members who once greeted her warmly now avoided her, as if her presence was a risk. Friends who once attended dinners at the mansion now sent vague messages, too polite to be helpful, too afraid to be honest. Maribel learned to stop reaching out, not because she stopped needing people, but because rejection started to feel like a second betrayal. She began to plan small survival steps, how to manage bills, how to stretch money, how to fill the emptiness with routine. Yet beneath every practical thought was a deeper ache, the knowledge that Adrian expected her to simply vanish quietly, to fold into the background like she had always been trained to do. On certain evenings, she'd stand by the window and watch the streetlights come on, thinking of him in a foreign city, laughing, eating, living. And sometimes, when the loneliness tightened around her chest, she whispered into the air, not a message to Adrian, because he had forbidden that, but a confession to God. I don't know how to start again. The silence answered her with nothing. And Maribel, sitting alone in the house that was supposed to be a favor, realized she wasn't just starting over. She was learning how to live in a world where the person who controlled everything had decided she was no longer worth hearing. Maribel did not suspect anything at first. Her body had been through so much emotional stress that fatigue felt normal, dizziness felt expected, and nausea felt like another side effect of heartbreak. She blamed the sleepless nights, the constant crying, the anxiety that refused to loosen its grip on her chest. It wasn't until one quiet morning, weeks after Adrian's departure, that she realized something was undeniably wrong or right, depending on how fate chose to interpret it. She had woken up with a strange heaviness in her lower abdomen, a dull sensation that felt different from pain, different from grief. When she tried to stand, the room spun briefly, forcing her to sit back down. Maribel pressed her palm against her stomach absent-mindedly, not in suspicion yet, but instinct. A memory stirred, counting days, recalling moments she had deliberately stopped thinking about since Adrian left. Her heart began to race, not with hope, but with fear. The thought arrived quietly, but refused to leave. What if? She pushed it away at first, scolding herself for reaching for something that could make her life even more complicated. But by midday, the thought had grown teeth. She wrapped a scarf around herself and walked to a nearby clinic, her steps slow, her breathing uneven, her heart already bracing for impact. The nurse's voice was gentle, almost rehearsed, as she delivered the result. You're pregnant. The words echoed in Maribel's ears like they belonged to someone else. She stared at the woman blankly, unable to speak, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Pregnant. The reality pressed down on her chest, heavy and sharp. Her first instinct was panic, not joy, not excitement, but panic. Adrian was gone. Gone by choice. Gone by design. Gone beyond reach. Her phone still held his contact, but it was useless, a name that led nowhere. The nurse noticed her silence and continued with the routine questions, but then paused, brows knitting together as she checked the scan again. "Madam," she said carefully, "there's something else." Maribel's fingers curled into her skirt as if bracing herself. "You're carrying more than one baby." Time slowed. The room felt too small. When the doctor confirmed it, triplets, Maribel's control shattered completely. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. She simply slid off the chair and cried the kind of cry that comes from a place beyond fear, beyond logic, beyond planning. 3 lives. 3 hearts. 3 futures. And she was alone. She locked herself in the hospital bathroom afterward, sinking onto the cold floor with her back against the wall. Her cries echoed off the tiles, raw and unfiltered. She thought of Adrian, not with longing, but disbelief. How could the man who walked away so confidently be the father of what was now growing inside her? She thought of calling him, then remembered his final words. "Don't contact me. I don't want reminders." And she realized the truth with painful clarity. There was no way to reach him even if she wanted to. He had cut every bridge and burned every road back. When Maribel finally stood up, her legs trembling, she wiped her face and looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were red, but beneath the shock, something else flickered. Resolve. If Adrian had decided she would disappear quietly, then he had underestimated her. She placed a trembling hand over her stomach and whispered, "I don't know how I'll do this, but I won't fail you." And with that promise made in tears, Maribel walked out of the clinic carrying a truth that would change everything, while the man responsible for it lived freely on the other side of the world, unaware. Pregnancy stripped Maribel down to her most honest self. There was no space left for denial, no room for pretending she was fine. Every morning reminded her that her body was no longer hers alone. The nausea came in relentless waves, the fatigue sat in her bones, and the emotional weight pressed on her chest like an invisible hand. Carrying 1 child would have been daunting enough, but carrying 3, alone, abandoned, unheard, felt like a test she never volunteered for. Yet Maribel did not run. She learned quickly how to rearrange her life around survival. She budgeted carefully, cut unnecessary expenses, and ignored the curious glances from neighbors who noticed her changing body, but knew nothing of her story. She told no one about Adrian, not her distant relatives, not old friends. She answered questions with polite deflections, choosing silence over explanation. Shame was not what stopped her, it was protection. She refused to let her children's story begin with whispers. As her belly grew, so did the memories she tried to suppress. Adrian's voice replayed itself in her mind during sleepless nights. "You're boring. Be grateful. I decide." Sometimes, the memories hurt more than the physical strain. She remembered the nights she waited for him, convincing herself that patience was love. She remembered the humiliation of begging for attention from a man who treated loyalty like weakness. Pregnancy had a cruel way of sharpening those memories, making them vivid and unavoidable. There were moments she pressed her forehead against the wall and whispered his name, not because she wanted him back, but because she wanted answers that would never come. And yet, even in those moments, something stronger always pulled her back. She would feel a flutter, then another, then another, 3 tiny reminders that she was no longer living only for herself. Slowly, heartbreak began to share space with purpose. By the time Maribel reached her 3rd trimester, she had made a decision she would not revisit. She would raise her children without bitterness. She attended her checkups faithfully, followed every instruction carefully, and endured every discomfort quietly. Nurses often commented on her calmness, unaware it was built from necessity, not peace. There were nights she lay awake calculating worst-case scenarios, medical emergencies, financial collapse, loneliness, but every calculation ended the same way. I will find a way. She stopped hoping Adrian would return. Hope, she learned, was dangerous when placed in the wrong hands. Instead, she poured her energy into preparing the house, folding tiny clothes, washing baby items alone under dim lights. Each fold, each wash, each careful step was an act of defiance against the narrative Adrian had written for her. She was not disappearing. She was becoming. 6 months after Adrian relocated overseas, the excitement he chased began to sour. The city that once felt like a promise started to feel unfamiliar, then unforgiving. The woman he had left Maribel for was not the fantasy he imagined from a distance. Away from the thrill of secrecy and stolen moments, reality set in. She was impatient with his long work hours, resentful of his emotional distance, and increasingly vocal about what she expected from him. Arguments became frequent, sharp, and exhausting. Adrian, who was used to control and admiration, found himself irritated by resistance. He had not left Nigeria to negotiate or compromise. He left to be indulged. The relationship, once fueled by excitement, slowly collapsed under the weight of unmet expectations. When it finally ended, it did so quietly, without drama or closure. One morning she packed her things, and that was it. No tears. No apologies. Adrian told himself it was for the best. But solitude has a way of exposing what noise hides. Adrian's apartment felt larger, emptier, colder. He filled his days with work, meetings, travel, anything that kept him busy enough not to think. Yet at night, the silence crept in. He dismissed it as temporary loneliness, convinced himself he was still winning at life. He told himself Maribel was probably adjusting well to the house he gave her, maybe even grateful. He never wondered if she struggled, never questioned if cutting her off completely had consequences. In his mind, the past was resolved simply because he declared it so. He focused instead on what he believed he deserved, a future unburdened by what he considered emotional weight. Still, cracks formed. He noticed them in small ways, irritation that lingered longer than it should, restlessness that sleep couldn't cure, a sense of dissatisfaction no purchase could fix. Friends asked casually if he planned to start a family someday. And for the first time, the question irritated him. He had assumed children would come easily once he found the right woman. Now, the thought unsettled him. But Adrian was not the kind of man who reflected deeply. When something felt uncomfortable, he replaced it instead of examining it. And so, he convinced himself again that all he needed was the right companion. He had no idea that while his life overseas was cracking quietly, the legacy he unknowingly abandoned was already growing, 3 times over, waiting for the moment it would collide with him in the most irreversible way. The night Maribel went into labor, the rain came without warning, heavy and unrelenting, drumming against the roof like a countdown she could not stop. She had been folding the last set of baby clothes when the pain struck, sharp, sudden, unmistakable. For a moment, fear threatened to overwhelm her, because there was no husband to call, no familiar voice to steady her nerves. She moved through the house slowly, breathing carefully, her hands trembling as she gathered the small bag she had prepared weeks earlier. A neighbor helped her get to the hospital, their concern genuine but restrained, unaware of the magnitude of what Maribel was about to face alone. The labor was long and unforgiving. Her body screamed for rest it could not have. Her mind drifted between consciousness and exhaustion, yet she pushed through with a strength she did not know she possessed. When the first cry finally filled the room, Maribel wept, not from pain, but from relief. Then another cry followed, and another. 3 fragile lives announced themselves into the world, each one a reminder that even in abandonment, something extraordinary could still be born. Recovery was slow and difficult. Maribel's body felt foreign, stretched beyond its limits, her energy drained to its core. Nurses moved in and out, offering practical help, but the emotional silence was hers alone to endure. There was no bouquet of flowers, no congratulatory message lighting up her phone, No partner pacing the hallway with anxious pride. When she held her children for the first time, 3 tiny faces, wrinkled and warm, something inside her shifted permanently. The loneliness did not disappear, but it transformed. It no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by responsibility. She named them quietly, whispering each name as if sealing a promise. Every soft breath they took anchored her to the present, forcing her to stop mourning the life she lost and focus on the one she now carried in her arms. When Maribel finally returned home, the house felt different. Smaller, louder, alive in ways it had never been before. Nights blurred into mornings as she learned to feed, soothe, and cradle 3 infants with a rhythm built from instinct and exhaustion. There were moments she broke down in the bathroom, crying silently so the babies wouldn't hear. Moments she questioned whether love alone was enough to sustain them. But each time doubt crept in, she returned to their faces and found the answer written there. She was not raising them out of revenge or hope for reconciliation. She was raising them because they existed, and because she refused to let the absence of a father define their worth. Adrian remained unaware, oceans away, living his life as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The first year was the hardest. Sleep became a luxury Maribel could not afford, and exhaustion became her constant companion. She learned to function on fragments of rest, moving through days with swollen eyes and steady hands. Money was tight, and every expense required careful calculation. She sold personal items she once treasured, not out of desperation, but determination. Pride had no place in survival. Slowly, she found small ways to earn, quiet, respectable ways that allowed her to remain close to her children. Neighbors noticed her resilience and stepped in when they could, offering help without intrusion. Maribel accepted assistance with gratitude, never allowing it to weaken her resolve. She learned to carry 3 children and her dignity at the same time. As the triplets grew, so did Maribel's confidence. Laughter replaced the constant crying, and routines settled into place. She memorized each child's habits, their different cries, their individual personalities, despite their identical faces. There were days she watched them play on the floor and felt a deep ache, not of sadness, but of awareness. Adrian had missed everything. The first smiles, the first steps, the moments when they reached for her instinctively, trusting her without question. She wondered occasionally if he would have been different had he known. But the thought passed quickly. Wondering changed nothing. She focused instead on shaping a stable world for her children, one built on consistency and warmth rather than wealth and control. By the second year, Maribel was no longer just surviving. She was standing. The house that once felt like exile now felt like home. She repainted walls, planted flowers, created corners of comfort. Her children were healthy, curious, and deeply bonded to her. She never brought another man into their lives, not because she feared judgment, but because her heart was still healing in quiet, deliberate ways. Love, she realized, was not something to rush back into. She had learned the cost of trusting the wrong hands. And so she waited, not for Adrian, not for romance, but for peace. She did not know that peace was about to be tested in the most unexpected way. Almost 2 years after leaving Nigeria, Adrian had achieved everything he thought he wanted. His career flourished, his accounts expanded, and his lifestyle remained enviable by any visible measure. Yet, beneath the polished surface, something was missing. His days were busy, but his nights were hollow. The apartment that once symbolized freedom now echoed with absence. He told himself it was normal, that success often required sacrifice. But the feeling persisted, a quiet dissatisfaction he could not silence. Conversations felt shallow. Relationships felt temporary. For the first time, Adrian felt the weight of solitude not as a choice, but as a consequence. When he met her, the woman who would briefly fill the gap, he convinced himself this was the answer. She was attentive, calm, and impressed by him in ways that fed his ego. The relationship moved quickly, not out of deep connection, but mutual convenience. Adrian enjoyed having someone to return to, someone who asked about his day and shared his space. Still, something about it felt incomplete. He ignored that feeling, just as he had ignored many before, believing time would smooth it out. He began to think about home, not with nostalgia, but practicality, properties, assets, loose ends. It was during one restless night that the thought occurred to him fully formed. Maribel. He assumed she had moved on, perhaps even remarried. The house he had gifted her came to mind, no longer as mercy, but as misplaced generosity. 2 years was enough time, he reasoned. Enough time for her to stabilize. Enough time for him to reclaim what was his. The decision settled easily in his mind, supported by entitlement and distance. He would return briefly, handle the matter cleanly, and resume his life abroad without complication. He had no idea that the moment he stepped back onto Nigerian soil, the story he thought he had finished would demand its ending. Adrian made the decision the way he made most decisions, quietly, confidently, and without consulting anyone who might challenge him. 1 month into his new relationship, he booked his flight back to Nigeria with the calm assurance of a man who believed time had worked in his favor. He told his new mistress it would be a short trip, nothing emotional, just unfinished business he needed to settle. He framed it as maturity, as closure, as responsibility. In his mind, Maribel was a chapter long concluded, a woman who had surely adjusted by now, perhaps even grateful for the house that had allowed her to start over. He imagined meeting her briefly, exchanging polite words, then reclaiming what he believed was rightfully his. The house was an asset, after all, not a monument to sentiment. Adrian convinced himself that any discomfort she felt would be temporary, manageable, and ultimately irrelevant. He had already rehearsed the tone he would use, firm, calm, reasonable. The same tone he had used when he left. During the flight, he barely slept. Not from anxiety, but from a restless sense of anticipation that he mistook for efficiency. He thought about how smooth everything would be once he tied up loose ends. He pictured Maribel as stable, possibly remarried, perhaps even indifferent to his return. That assumption comforted him. It allowed him to believe he was not disrupting anything meaningful. He did not imagine her struggling, nor did he consider the possibility that life might have unfolded beyond the narrow script he wrote for her. His confidence was reinforced by distance. 2 years was a long time, long enough for people to change, to move on, to fade. Adrian had no idea that time had not erased him from Maribel's life. It had simply transformed his absence into something tangible, breathing, and irreversible. When he landed, the familiarity of Nigeria felt strangely distant. The air was thicker, the sound sharper, the memories more persistent than he expected. He checked into a hotel with his mistress, made a few calls, and arranged transportation for the following morning. That night, he slept poorly, not from guilt, but from the strange feeling that something was waiting for him. He dismissed it as jet lag. He had always trusted his instincts, and his instincts told him this visit would be straightforward. He would assert control, reclaim his property, and return overseas with one less loose end. What he did not realize was that the very confidence guiding him back was about to betray him completely. The morning Adrian drove to the house, he was composed, almost attached. His mistress sat beside him, observing quietly, curiosity flickering in her eyes. She had asked only once about Maribel, and Adrian had waved it off with a dismissive explanation. An ex, nothing complicated. As the car slowed in front of the familiar gate, Adrian felt a brief tightening in his chest, a sensation he ignored. He stepped out first, straightened his jacket, and prepared himself for a conversation he believed he controlled. Then he saw her. Maribel stood near the entrance, her posture slightly tense but steady, holding a small child against her chest while 2 other children stood close, gripping the fabric of her skirt. Adrian stopped mid-step. The world seemed to pause, sound dulling, movement slowing. 3 children. Identical. The resemblance hit him without warning, sharp and disorienting. His breath caught not because he understood, but because something deep inside him recoiled. His mistress noticed his reaction immediately. Her eyes moved from the children to Adrian's frozen expression, then back to Maribel, confusion settling into suspicion. "Adrian," she whispered, but he didn't respond. Maribel looked up then, and the moment their eyes met, her composure shattered. Tears welled instantly, spilling over as years of buried pain surged to the surface. She did not move toward him, nor did she turn away. She simply stood there, crying silently, clutching the child in her arms like an anchor. Adrian forced himself to breathe, to speak, to act normal. "Maribel," he said slowly, the name unfamiliar on his tongue after so long. His voice sounded foreign even to himself. He glanced at the children again, then back at her face. "Congratulations," he added stiffly, as if the word alone could bridge the confusion churning inside him. The mistress shifted uncomfortably, her gaze sharp now. "Whose children are those?" she asked, her tone careful but edged. Adrian shot her a quick look, then returned his attention to Maribel. The question hung, heavy, in the air. Maribel opened her mouth, then closed it again, her chest rising unevenly as she tried to steady herself. She could not answer, not yet. Adrian took her silence as confirmation of his assumptions. He nodded once, as if settling something internally. "We need to talk," he said, regaining his practiced calm. "About the house." The words fell like stones. Even as he said them, the children stared up at him with curious eyes, unaware of the storm forming around them. They moved inside, the tension following them like a shadow. Adrian stood near the center of the living room, surveying the space with a critical eye, noting changes, improvements, signs of life that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. His mistress lingered nearby, arms crossed, watching Maribel closely, her curiosity sharpened into discomfort. Maribel wiped her face quickly, embarrassed by her tears, but unable to stop her hands from shaking. Adrian cleared his throat, returning to the purpose he had rehearsed. "I didn't come to stay long," he said evenly. "I came to resolve something." He gestured vaguely around the room. "This house." Maribel's heart sank, though she had expected it. Hearing it out loud still hurt. "I assumed by now you would have moved on," Adrian continued, tone measured. 2 years is enough time. I'll need the property back." The words were clinical, devoid of emotion, as though he were discussing paperwork rather than a woman's life. Maribel felt her knees weaken, but she remained standing. The children sensed the shift and pressed closer to her, their small hands gripping her clothing. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. Everything she had carried for 2 years pressed against her chest at once. Adrian mistook her silence for resignation. "I'm not trying to be unreasonable," he added, though there was no softness in his voice. "I'll give you time to relocate. We'll sort out the details." His mistress nodded faintly, though her eyes never left the children. "This is sudden," she said carefully. "I thought you said." Adrian cut her off with a glance. "This is between me and my ex-wife." Maribel finally found her voice, but it came out broken. "You can't just come back and take everything," she whispered. Adrian frowned, impatience flickering across his face. "I gave you more than enough," he replied. "This wasn't permanent. You knew that." The words sliced through her. She looked at him, really looked at him, and realized how little he understood. He saw a house. She saw the place where her children took their first steps, where she cried in silence, where she rebuilt herself piece by piece. Tears streamed down her face again, unrestrained now. Adrian shifted uncomfortably, unsettled by her emotion, but unmoved by it. He did not know that every word he spoke was brushing against a truth he had no defense against. And as the room filled with tension and unspoken history, the secret Maribel carried pressed closer to the surface, waiting for the moment it would no longer stay hidden. The next hour unfolded in fragments, thick with words that were never said and truths that hovered just out of reach. Adrian paced the living room slowly, his movements controlled, deliberate, as though he were in a boardroom rather than standing inside the life he once abandoned. He spoke about timelines, about legality, about how things could be handled civilly, all while avoiding direct eye contact with Maribel. His mistress sat stiffly on one of the chairs, her posture guarded, her eyes moving constantly between Adrian and the children, trying to assemble a picture that refused to make sense. The triplets watched quietly from the floor, their expressions curious but calm, sensing tension without understanding its source. Maribel stood near the doorway, one hand resting protectively on the back of the chair closest to her, grounding herself so she wouldn't collapse under the weight of the moment. Every sentence Adrian spoke sounded distant to her, like noise traveling through water. She heard the words, but they no longer landed the way they once did. As minutes stretched into silence, memories flooded Maribel's mind uninvited. The night Adrian packed his bags, the promise that she would never hear from him again, the months of pregnancy she endured alone. She looked at him now and felt something strange, not anger, not longing, but disbelief at how little he still saw. He spoke as though the last 2 years were a pause rather than a lifetime. At one point, his mistress shifted and asked quietly, "How old are they?" The question sliced through the air. Maribel hesitated, then answered softly, "Almost 2." Adrian froze mid-step, his brow furrowing briefly before he masked it with indifference. "That's good," he said vaguely, as if age were irrelevant. But something inside him stirred uneasily, a faint echo he did not yet recognize as recognition. The silence returned heavier than before. Maribel felt the truth pressing against her chest, demanding release. She had not planned to say anything. Not today, not like this, but the weight of carrying it alone had become unbearable. She watched Adrian continue to speak about logistics, watched his mistress nod stiffly, and realized that if she stayed silent any longer, the story of her life would once again be written without her voice. Her hands trembled as she drew in a breath. The hour had passed not because time moved slowly, but because courage took time to gather. And when Maribel finally lifted her head, something in her expression shifted, quiet, resolved, irreversible. "Adrian," Maribel said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet firm enough to cut through the room. He turned, irritation flickering briefly before fading into confusion at the look on her face. She wasn't crying anymore. Her eyes were red, yes, but steady, focused, as if she had crossed an internal line and could not go back. The mistress leaned forward instinctively, sensing that whatever was coming would change everything. Maribel swallowed hard and said the words that had lived inside her for 2 years. "Those children, they are yours." For a moment, no one moved. The air itself seemed to freeze. Adrian stared at her, then laughed, a short, sharp sound filled with disbelief. "That's not funny," he said, shaking his head. "Don't do this." His laugh faded when Maribel didn't react. "You're lying," he added, more forcefully now. "You're trying to manipulate me." Maribel shook her head slowly. "I found out weeks after you left," she said, her voice trembling now despite her effort to stay composed. "I tried to reach you. I couldn't. Everything was cut off." Adrian's expression hardened, anger replacing disbelief. "That's convenient," he snapped. 2 years later, when I come back for my property, suddenly I have triplets?" He turned to his mistress, gesturing sharply. "Can you hear this?" The mistress's face had gone pale, her lips slightly parted as she stared at the children again, this time with dread. Maribel did not raise her voice. She did not beg. "I'm not asking you to believe me without proof," she said quietly. "Do a DNA test." The calmness in her tone unsettled him more than tears would have. Adrian's jaw tightened. He paced again, agitation bleeding through his composure. "Fine," he said finally, voice cold. "We'll do a DNA test. And when it comes back negative, this ends." He looked at Maribel with something close to disdain. "Don't expect anything from me." Maribel nodded once. That was all. She had done what she could. The truth was no longer locked inside her. The mistress remained silent, her earlier confidence gone, replaced by unease and suspicion. As Adrian reached for his phone to make arrangements, Maribel felt an unexpected calm settle over her. She had carried the truth long enough. What happened next was no longer hers to control. Adrian did not stay. Within the hour he gathered his things and left the house with his mistress, his movements sharp and restless, his mind visibly spiraling despite his effort to appear unaffected. He booked accommodation elsewhere, insisting they needed space until the test was done. The mistress followed him reluctantly, her questions unanswered, her trust clearly shaken. In the car, Adrian said little. He replayed Maribel's words in his head, rejecting them again and again, clinging to denial like a shield. Triplets. 2 years old. The math felt dangerous, so he avoided it. Denial, after all, had always served him well. Back at the house, Maribel closed the door quietly and leaned against it, her legs finally giving way beneath her. She slid down to the floor, pressing a hand over her mouth to muffle a sob. The children gathered around her instinctively, touching her face, her shoulders, offering comfort in the only way they knew how. She pulled them close, breathing in their scent, grounding herself in their warmth. Telling the truth had not brought relief the way she imagined. It had brought vulnerability. But even in that vulnerability, she felt lighter. Whatever happened next, she had not lied. She had not hidden. She had spoken. That night, Maribel did not sleep. Neither did Adrian. They lay in different houses, different worlds, bound by the same waiting. For Maribel, the weight was familiar. She had lived in uncertainty for 2 years already. For Adrian, it was unbearable. The possibility he had dismissed so easily now loomed larger with every passing hour. And somewhere between denial and fear, the truth began to crack through his certainty, preparing him for a reality he was not ready to face. The days that followed stretched painfully, thick with uncertainty and restrained fear. For Maribel, waiting had become a familiar companion. But this kind of waiting felt different, heavier, louder, more exposed. She returned to her routine with deliberate care, waking early, preparing meals, washing clothes, singing softly to the children as if nothing monumental hovered over their lives. Yet beneath every ordinary action lay the knowledge that strangers now held pieces of her truth in sterile envelopes, reducing 2 years of sacrifice into data points and percentages. At night, after the triplets fell asleep, Maribel sat alone in the quiet living room, replaying Adrian's face when she spoke the truth. She did not regret telling him. What frightened her was not rejection. It was the possibility of intrusion. If the test confirmed what she knew, her carefully rebuilt world would be disturbed again. And this time, the disturbance would come wearing entitlement. Adrian, on the other hand, unraveled quietly. He told himself he was calm, that this was merely a formality, yet his body betrayed him. He slept in short bursts, waking suddenly with a racing heart, his mind cycling through fragments of memory he had long buried, the last nights with Maribel, the exact timing of his departure, the uneasy resemblance he could no longer unsee. His mistress noticed the shift immediately. He was distracted, irritable, withdrawn. She asked questions he refused to answer fully, and her patience thinned with each day. The children haunted her thoughts too, though she tried to suppress it. Something fundamental had changed the moment Maribel spoke. Adrian's confidence no longer felt solid, it felt brittle. As the days passed, the mistress grew colder, more distant. She began to imagine a future she had not signed up for, a man tied permanently to an ex-wife, and 3 children he did not know existed. Adrian sensed her withdrawal, but lacked the emotional clarity to address it. His mind was consumed by one question he was afraid to ask out loud. What if it's true? He had always believed he could outrun consequences. Now, for the first time, he felt cornered by them. The waiting stripped him of his usual armor, leaving only a restless man staring down a truth he could neither confirm nor escape. The message arrived on a quiet morning, short and impersonal, instructing Adrian to come in for the results. He stared at his phone for a long moment before responding, his fingers numb, his breath shallow. The drive to the clinic felt longer than it should have, every traffic light an obstacle, every passing second tightening the knot in his chest. His mistress did not come with him. She claimed she had errands, but they both knew the real reason. Whatever waited at that clinic would redraw lines she wasn't prepared to cross. Adrian walked in alone, shoulders stiff, jaw clenched, carrying arrogance like a shield that no longer fit. The room where he received the results was small, neutral, designed to absorb reactions without reacting back. The technician spoke calmly, professionally, explaining procedures, percentages, certainty. Adrian barely heard the words at first. Then the phrase cut through everything else. Probability of paternity. 99.9%. Once. Twice. 3 times. 1 for each child. The paper trembled in his hand as he stared at the numbers, willing them to change, to rearrange themselves into something less devastating. But the ink remained still. The truth was final, undeniable, absolute. 3 children. His children. Children he had abandoned before they took their first breath. The world narrowed abruptly. The room tilted. Adrian's ears rang as if someone had struck a bell inside his skull. His chest tightened painfully, air refusing to move the way it should. He tried to stand, to say something, but his knees buckled beneath him. The technician reached forward just as Adrian collapsed to the floor, the paper slipping from his fingers. In that moment, wealth meant nothing. Control meant nothing. The identity he had built, successful, untouchable, free, crumbled under the weight of a truth he could not negotiate with. For the first time in his life, Adrian had no argument, no escape, no leverage. Only loss. When Adrian regained awareness, he was seated, water pressed into his hands, voices murmuring around him. But their concern felt distant, irrelevant. His mind replayed one image repeatedly. 3 small faces looking up at him with quiet curiosity. Faces he now knew carried his blood, his absence, his failure. He left the clinic without ceremony. The results folded tightly in his pocket like a verdict he could not tear up. Outside, the sky looked unchanged, indifferent to the earthquake that had just split his life open. He sat in his car for a long time without starting the engine, forehead resting against the steering wheel, shoulders shaking with the kind of sobs he had never allowed himself before. This was not embarrassment. This was not fear of reputation. This was grief, for moments he could never recover. The mistress did not answer his calls at first. When she finally did, her voice was distant, guarded. Adrian did not explain properly. He did not know how. He only said, "They're mine." Silence followed. Long, heavy, final. She told him she needed time, space, clarity. Adrian understood what she didn't say aloud. She was already halfway gone. The future he imagined with her dissolved instantly, replaced by one far more complicated and far more demanding. For the first time, he did not try to control the outcome. He had no strength left for strategy. That night, Adrian returned alone to another house, sat in darkness, and let the truth crush him fully. He thought of Maribel, her tears, her silence, her strength. He thought of the years he stole from himself by believing power replaced presence. He collapsed again, not physically this time, but internally, surrendering to the weight of what he had done. Somewhere across the city, Maribel slept beside her children, unaware that the man who once walked away without a backward glance had finally fallen apart under the cost of his own decisions. The days after the collapse were slow and disorienting for Adrian, as if time itself had decided to punish him by moving too carefully. He avoided people, ignored calls, canceled meetings that once defined his sense of importance. The house he stayed in felt temporary, hollow, walls without meaning, rooms without memory. Everywhere he looked, he saw the children's faces reflected back at him in fragments of thought, the way they had stood close to Maribel, the way one had stared at him with curiosity rather than fear. He replayed that moment endlessly, realizing with a sickening clarity that they had looked at him without judgment because they did not know him. And that ignorance he understood now was his doing. The DNA results sat on his desk like a silent witness, the ink unchanged, the truth unyielding. Each time he looked at the paper, something inside him folded in on itself, not dramatically, but permanently. His mistress grew distant in ways that did not require explanation. Conversations became short, then rare. When they finally spoke face to face, there were no raised voices, only resignation. She told him she hadn't signed up for this kind of life, for shared history, for children who would always come first, for a past that refused to stay buried. Adrian did not argue. For once, he did not try to persuade or control. He nodded, accepted her departure with a quietness that surprised even him. As she walked away, he felt no anger, only the dull understanding that he had created a pattern. Arrive, take, leave, and now that pattern had finally turned against him. He was alone again, but this time, loneliness was not a choice. It was a consequence. Maribel felt the shift before she saw him again. Not because she sensed his pain, but because silence has weight, and she had learned to recognize when something heavy was moving toward her life. She focused on her children, maintaining routine, keeping her voice calm, refusing to let anxiety leak into their world. She did not celebrate the truth, nor did she fear it. She simply waited. Waiting had shaped her for years now, carving patience into her bones. She knew Adrian would come. Men like him always did, when certainty collapsed, when control slipped, when pride finally broke. What she did not know was what she would say when he stood before her again. And for the first time, that uncertainty belonged to her, not him. Adrian returned to the house quietly, without announcement, without entourage, without the armor he once wore so effortlessly. He stood at the gate for a moment before entering, watching through the bars as Maribel sat on the floor with the children, laughing softly as they stacked blocks and knocked them over again. The sound stopped him cold. It was ordinary, gentle, real, everything he had dismissed when he left. When Maribel noticed him, her smile faded, replaced by a guarded stillness. She stood slowly, positioning herself instinctively between him and the children, not aggressively, but protectively. Adrian took a step forward, then stopped, as if afraid to disturb the fragile order she had built. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse. "I know," he said simply. "They're mine." Maribel did not react. She did not nod. She did not deny it. She waited. What followed was not the polished speech Adrian once delivered so confidently. It was fractured, imperfect, stripped of entitlement. He apologized, not once, but repeatedly, for leaving, for cutting her off, for assuming she would disappear quietly, for trying to take the house back without seeing the life inside it. His voice broke when he spoke about the children, about how he had missed everything that mattered. He vowed, without conditions, to leave his new mistress behind, to stop running, to be present. Not as a savior, not as a controller, but as a father willing to learn from the beginning. He did not demand forgiveness. He did not ask for a second chance as a husband. He asked only for the right to be in his children's lives, to show up, to do better than the man he had been. Maribel listened without interruption, her face unreadable, her hand steady. When he finished, silence settled between them, thick but calm. The children tugged at her dress, asking softly for attention, unaware of the gravity of what had just been said. Maribel knelt to them, adjusted a shirt collar, brushed hair from a small forehead, grounding herself in the present before standing again. She looked at Adrian, really looked at him, and in her eyes there was no triumph, no softness, no promise. Only consideration. She did not answer him. Not yes. Not no. She turned back to her children, guiding them inside, closing the door gently behind her. Adrian remained where he stood, surrounded by the weight of his words, finally understanding that forgiveness, like love, was not something he could decide alone anymore. Please like and subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching to the end. Don't forget to come back for the next amazing tale yet.